Welcome to the Pentaho Reporting video course. In the first section, we are going to see how to start with Pentaho Reporting, and we'll learn the installation of Pentaho Reporting Client, so-called Pentaho Report Designer. Our first task is to check the prerequisites of the system. Both Pentaho Reporting and Pentaho Report Designer are written in pure Java, thus allowing the application to be run by any operating system with a Java virtual machine. In our case, we use Java 7. Next, we need to download the Pentaho Report Designer from the Pentaho website. So we downloaded the archived package and now have it ready to be unzipped in the download folder. To install the binary distribution is very easy. Just create a directory in your machine and unzip the contents of the package into this directory. The Pentaho Reporting installation includes Hypersonic in-memory database server. We're going to be using this throughout the whole video course. Now you are able to install the Pentaho Design Report and get it started. You can run it by a simple double-click on the Report Designer script in the installation directory. Please notice that in this folder you will also find scripts with different extensions for both Windows and Macintosh-based operating systems. After a few seconds, you can see the Report Designer welcome screen, which looks like this. Behind the welcome screen, there is the user interface, which is mainly composed of menu and toolbar. In the report element palette, vertical bar on the left, you'll find all basic elements to be dragged and dropped into your report. The Report Canvas tab panel contains a set of bands which arrange your report. On the right, you see the Report Explorer with a tree structure, which describes details about every report object displayed on the report canvas. The element properties contain styles and attributes of any single object described in the report canvas. Last but not least is the optional canvas with the messages panel, which displays help, warning and error messages. Now you are able to install the Pentaho Design Report and get it started. In the next section, we will proceed with loading and saving reports and seeing their preview in different formats. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to install the Pentaho Report Designer and we got to know its user interface. In this section, we're going to see how to load and save reports and how to preview them in any available format. Pentaho Reporting has two options to archive reports: file system and the database, which in Pentaho Reporting terminology is called repository. To load and save a report using the file system is very similar to how normal files are loaded and saved. In this example, we will load a report from the file system using the Open item under the File menu. We need to find the right folder and click on the report. The Save As item from the File menu lets us save the report with any preferred name in any preferred folder. To load and save a report using a database, the so-called repository, is done in the same way. Under the File menu, there are special menu items, Open from Repository and Publish item. In this example, we will load a report from a repository specifying the connection parameters and finding the report in the folders the repository is made up of. In order to save the report with any preferred name in any preferred folder, we can use the Publish item in the File menu. Since our reports are loaded and saved in the archive, file system or repository, we are able to see their preview and get to know all available formats of the preview feature. There are two different ways to see a preview of our report: by using the Report Canvas tab panel or by using the Preview button. In the Report Canvas tab panel, you can see an eye icon. Clicking the eye, a preview is shown directly on the canvas. Clicking the Preview button, visible on the top toolbar as a green arrow, a drop-down list shows all available formats. Selecting one of them, the report is generated and opened in the requested format. In this video, we took one of our reports and tried to load it from an archive and save it back. We also learned how to see a preview of our reports in different formats. In the next tutorial, we're going to see how to build a brand new report by using the Report Wizard. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to load and save reports by using either a file system or a repository, and how to obtain a preview of the report in various formats. In this section, we're going to see how to build a brand new report by using the Report Wizard. There are two different ways to build a report. The first one, quick and simple, is to use a wizard, and the second, a manual one, which is more precise and customizable but labor intensive. Let's start to develop our first report by using the Report Wizard. The Report Wizard can be started from the Report Wizard item under File menu. The first step in the creation of the wizard is to define its preferred appearance. There are 4 different templates provided. We choose the Cobalt one. Then we have to choose a data source used to connect to a database instance. The last one contains the data, which will be shown in our report. Let's see how. In our case, we use JDBC connection to a sample database and to a sample query already defined in the environment. In the layout step, we choose fields shown in the report by defining one or more of them used in the layout as groups. We define a report with product vendor as group, product code, product name, quantity in stock, buy price as field. In the last one, format step, we may define labels and descriptions of all fields. Let's fill in the group header label. By clicking on a detailed field, we can also customize other formatting characteristics. Of course, the same label is described for the grouping fields. We can also change other settings like the alignment, the data format, the width of the column result, and finally the aggregation formula. Let's define the layout for all other fields. Defining name for the product name, stock for the quantity in stock with the correct format and column width, price for the buy price with the correct format and column width. We have finished our task and can press the finish button to create the report. Let's complete the report by giving it a title and a subtitle with the value Pentaho Report Designer, and let's preview it, for example in PDF format. In this tutorial, we developed the complete report by using the wizard. In the next tutorial, we will see how to build and customize a report manually. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to create a brand new report by using the report wizard. In this tutorial, we will build a report manually by using a more precise and customizable method. The first task is to create a new empty report by clicking on the new item in the File menu or by clicking on the blank paper icon in the toolbar. Before starting to develop the appearance of the report, we need to define a data source. The data source is the basis of every report because it defines the list of fields requested for the viewing of results, for the making of charts, for the calculating of formulas and so on. By right-clicking on the Dataset section, it is possible to define a new dataset and choose its type from a wide list of options. We'll discuss all the available types of dataset in section 3, but in our example, we use the most common one, the JDBC. By clicking on it, we get a panel, which has a connection canvas on the left, available queries on the top right, and query details in the bottom line. The next task is to use an existing connection or define a new one. In our case, we use an existing connection. It is very simple to create a new one by using the green plus icon. Let's see in details how the sample data connection has been defined. It shows the connection parameters in terms of the connection type, then settings, and finally the type of access. The Test button tests if the configuration is correct or not. It's important to notice that the default installation of Pentaho Report Designer does not provide all JDBC drivers to the sources, even if they are listed in this panel. To install a JDBC driver in the Pentaho reporting environment, you simply have to copy into the Report Designer lib JDBC folder the jar file containing the driver. In our case, we installed the PostgreSQL JDBC driver beforehand. Let's continue with the data source configuration. Let's test the connection in order to check everything is working fine. Once the connection to the data source is properly configured, the next task is to define a query over it. To define a new query, simply press the green plus icon on the top right. Let's give it a title. In the bottom right of the canvas, we can digit manually or query or compose it using a simple query designer. We can select a table or define a more complex query over multiple tables and press OK when we are satisfied with the result. Now our first dataset is well defined, and we can go ahead with the layout and build a very simple report with these fields. Looking at the user interface, we can see that here are many bands, which represent different parts of our report. We want to define a new report with a title in the header and with some fields on the products, which will be retrieved in the details. To define the title of our report, we have to focus on the report header band, dragging on the label element from the report element palette on the left and dropping it into the report header. We can define the title we like. In our case, we set the value to Label My First Report with the blue font color of the text. In order to define the report details, we will work on the details band. This time, we will use the text field element for our text. There are a number of options here. We'll choose product name and the number field element for our numbers. Let me adjust the number field a bit, and we'll select quantity and align it to the right. That's it. We have defined our report manually, and now we can preview it. We can also preview the document in Excel format. Today we learnt the basics of the manual creation of a report with Pentaho Report Designer. Next time we'll learn how to customize a report and its components. Now that we know the basics of the manual development of a report with Pentaho Report Designer, maybe we'd like to know how to customize all of its various parts and components. Let's start by customizing the page header and page footer of our report. In the page header, we want to put a company logo and its label. Let's import the company logo from a file containing an image and define a label as a title. Let's also change the format of the title so that it's more appealing. Let's add a pleasant blue colour to this text. In the page footer, we want to show the date. Let's use the report date in the text field. Let's preview our report. In some cases, we'd like to have the details of the report grouped by a field or value. For example, it could be interesting to group the results, the products, by product line. To obtain this result, we will work on the group item in the structure. The first thing to do is to view the group details in terms of group header footer and show the header footer bands to work on it. Next, we have to set the group in the dataset field, in our case the product line. Now everything is ready to set the group field in the group header. Let's add product line, customizing it to make it look a bit more presentable, with the right font, the right alignment, the right color and dimension. Let's have a look at the report now. With this task, we have to pay attention to a possible problem caused by the query. In fact, if the query is not properly ordered, the grouping results could be badly presented. Let's edit the query for our purpose. In particular, let's request the ascending order of the results by product line. The next task is to set up the results labels. Let's add a text field and name it product. Format the label as a title. And add a new text field and name it stock with the same format of the product label. Let's preview the final result. In this tutorial, we learned how to customize a report with the Pentaho Report Designer. Next time, we'll be exploring more deep customizations and advanced features in details. Now that we know about the manual development of a report with Pentaho Report Designer, we'd like to know how to make more advanced customizations. Before that, let's dig deep in the user interface. We'll start by showing and customizing the grid and the guidelines. The grid is showed by default. We can hide it or change its settings. Regarding the visual indicators, we can toggle between the default outline selection or the clamp selection. The overlapping indicator is very important. It turns red when it's overlapping another field. Here I'm going to overlap the two fields in several sides to show how you can view it. To remove the visual indicator, uncheck the item Show the overlapping elements under the View menu. To control the visibility of an element relative to other elements that may overlap, use Format, Arrange to bring it forward or backwards. Very useful if you want to align more than one element is the alignment option. You just have to shift select both the text fields and align it wherever you wish. Very efficient. There are some additional layout features that make your life easier. The first is the ability to paste the formatting of an element into another. Last but not least, some useful considerations on different output formats. When rendering to CSV, Excel, RTF, and in some cases HTML, we have to pay attention that cell layout is still appropriate. Pagination, of course, could depend on certain formats. For example, in HTML, you get the report as a single page. Finally, we have to note that not all the formats are able to embed rich graphics and charts. For example, CSV. In this section, we got started with Pentaho Reporting and Pentaho Report Designer. In the next, we'll dig deep into the Pentaho Reporting Engine's XML and Java API. In the previous section, we introduced Pentaho Report Designer. Our goal was to familiarize ourselves with the user interface and build our very first report. In this section, we're going to dive deeper into the Pentaho Reporting Engine XML and Java APIs and start to set up the environment for development. We're going to set up the environment on a Linux-based system, the Ubuntu distribution. The steps are similar for other operating systems. We start with an installed Java runtime and check the version from the terminal. Now we can install Eclipse. To install the Eclipse IDE, we need to go to the official website and download the required version. In our case, we can find it directly in the download folder. Installing Eclipse is very straightforward. Just extract the zipped archive into the target folder. We chose the desktop. We're now ready to start Eclipse, but first we need to install the Apache Tomcat servlet container that we'll use to develop and run our web application. Let's download the installation archive from the Apache Tomcat official website. We downloaded it previously, so the archive is already located in the Downloads folder. To install Tomcat, we simply need to extract the zipped archive in the target directory /opt. Let's test that Tomcat is properly installed by starting its service. You can access the localhost URL to check everything is working properly. OK, Tomcat is up and running. Let's now stop the service. It's time to run Eclipse for the first time and choose a workspace. When we start Eclipse, we have to add a new Tomcat server and configure the adapter with the server wizard. All we need to do is specify the root folder where Tomcat is located. In our case, opt Apache Tomcat. Finally, we can start Tomcat from inside the Eclipse IDE. Now that we know how to set up the development environment, let's see how to embed a Pentaho report in an enterprise web application using Eclipse and Tomcat. Now that we have configured a development environment, we're going to embed an existing Pentaho report in an enterprise web application. First of all, we have to define our basic web application, which in our case is a very simple dynamic web project with an index.html file containing a link, and a dynamic page we developed using the MyFirstWebApp class. Now we're ready to deploy the project in Tomcat. Drag and drop it to the Server tab and view the result in a browser. When we click the link, we expect to render the video in the browser itself, but for now we've just got a static page. So now we need to change the application so that it opens an existing Pentaho report developed with the Pentaho Report Designer. The first thing we do is add the libraries to the lib folder in webinf. We're going to be using an in-memory database HSQLDB, so we'll have to put the resources containing the sample data database used in the report into the build path folder. In our case, resources sample data. Finally, let's add the right code to the MyFirstWebApp class. The code we added is simple and contains some imported libraries and a few lines of Java in the method body. let's go through this Java code. First, there's a command to start the Pentaho Report Engine instance. Then, a few lines to define the resource file PRPT containing the Pentaho report. 2 lines to create the Pentaho report object in the Java environment, and the code to generate the response containing the report in the requested format, in this case PDF. Now it's time to see the result. Here, we've seen how to embed an existing Pentaho report into an enterprise web application. Next time, we'll embed the same Pentaho report inside a Java Swing application. In this video, we're going to see how to embed an existing Pentaho report into a Swing application. First of all, we have to define our basic Swing application. In our case, a very simple Java project with a single MyFirstSwingApp class. Here, we're rendering a button that when we click it, will display a message in the output stream, in our case, the console. Let's see it in action. Now, let's complete the application by modifying it to render the report when we press the button. The first thing we need to do is add the libraries to the lib folder in Webin. After copying the jars in the lib folder, we add them to the Java build path to make them visible in the project. In our case, we're going to use an in-memory database with HSQLDB. So we have to put the resources that contain the sample data database used in the report into the path folder. Finally, let's put the right code into the MyFirstSwingApp class. We're adding some basic code that's made up of a few lines of Java in the method body. The Java code is straightforward and contains a command to start the Pentaho Reporting Engine instance. A few lines to define the resources that make up the file PRPT containing the Pentaho report. 2 lines to create the Pentaho report object in the Java environment. And the code to generate the preview containing the report in the requested format. Now it's time to see the result. We'll wait for the launch of the application and then we can push the button to view it. Now that we're able to embed an existing Pentaho report in a Swing application, let's take a look inside the structure of a PRPT report. In the previous sections, we introduced Pentaho Reporting as a single file with a PRPT extension. In this video, we want to dive inside the structure of that file and understand how it's defined and how it's made up. The first thing to consider is that the PRPT file is a kind of zip-based file format that includes all the necessary resources to render a report. Most of them are XML files, as well as additional resources such as embedded images and sub-reports. The format of the PRPT file is based on the Open Document format. The most important files that make up a report are settings.xml, datadefinition.xml, layout.xml, styles.xml. Settings.xml contains global configuration properties for a report, but you rarely need to define them when generating a report. Datadefinition.xml contains information about the report data sources and other advanced things like parameters, functions, and expressions. Looking at our report, we can see a data source linked to datasources compoundds.xml file, which contains a single data factory that holds the data source details. Layout.xml defines the primary structure of the bands contained in a report and their elements. Each band is an XML element structured hierarchically with other XMLs for the elements, sub-elements, etc. In our case, there is a group tag for the product line and a details tag for product name field, quantity in stock field, etc. Styles.xml defines page format, style rules, global layout processes, watermarks, and finally, header and footer sections. In our case, we can see, for example, the composition of the page header, the text style, and the report date as a text field in the page footer. As we can see in the PRPT archive, additional files are required to complete the archive, but are less central to the rendering of the report. the meta-inf/manifest.xml contains a complete list of the PRPT files together with their content type. The content.xml is left empty, but is used to inject global templates later on. The dataschema.xml contains additional metadata. The meta.xml is requested by the Open Document Standard and contains information about the PRPT file. The MIME type contains the MIME type of the PRPT file. Now that we're able to understand and build the content of a PRPT file, let's build a report using the Pentaho Reporting Java API. In the last topic, we introduced the PRPT structure for a generic Pentaho report. In this video, we're going to build and run a report using the Pentaho Reporting Java API. To start developing our report, we use the basic swing application described in the previous topics. With this sample, we can generate an empty report with a preview after pressing the button. Let's launch the application to view the result. Now it's time to add a header and footer that show the report title. To complete the task, we add some simple code. Let's import automatically the requested libraries using Eclipse. In the code, we declare a report header object and a report footer object. They are added to the report, and finally we define a label which contains the title we added to the header and footer. Let's view the result. There you go, our first report using Java APIs. Next, we want to add a table data composed of two fields, product name and quantity. To do this, we'll add some source code previously prepared for this purpose, directly after the header definition. Let's import automatically the requested libraries using Eclipse. The first thing to do is define a table data with its own structure. Afterwards, we define an item band for the details. And finally, the data fields, one for the textual description of the product and one for the number layout of the quantity. Let's view the result. Now that we are able to build and run a report using the Pentaho Reporting Java API, let's see how to configure JDBC database and other data sources. In section 1, we saw how to build a report and the importance of the connection to a database. In this video, we dive deep into the configuration of the different types of data sources, starting with the JDBC. First, let's create a new data source directly inside a new report. Once we are in the Data Source Administration panel, we can define a new data source and create one or more queries. Defining a new data source is straightforward. We do this by pressing the green plus icon in the top left of the canvas. You see the new panel. The first thing to do is to give the data source a name, and afterwards we can go ahead and choose a database type. As you can see, there's a huge amount of usable database types, from the most common ones to the most specific, open source or proprietary. It's very important to note that the default installation of Pentaho Report Designer does not provide all the JDBC drivers to the different sources, even if they are listed in this panel. To install a JDBC driver in the Pentaho reporting environment, you simply have to copy the jar file containing the driver into the Report Designer lib JDBC folder. In our case, we'll do it for the PostgreSQL and MySQL. Let's continue with the data source configuration, specifying the parameters requested by the connection. And last but not least, we must test the connection, check everything is okay. Once the database connection is defined, our next task is to define one or more queries. To add a new query, we can simply use the green plus icon in the panel and specify a name in the bottom right panel. If you prefer to do it with a wizard, you can use the query wizard. Select Public and click on OK. In our case, we select the name field from the country table and adjust the query. Let's see the preview. Once the data source is prepared, we're ready to define our report. Before closing the tutorial, If we need to change the data source connection, it is easily done using the administration panel. Open the JDBC administration panel in the menu, change the database type to MySQL, for example, and everything is done. Of course, if the syntax of the defined queries is different for the new database, the queries must be changed in the way we've already seen. In this video, we learn how to define and change a JDBC connection for a data source. Next time, we'll configure the data source to a Mondrian OLAP engine. Now that we know how to configure a JDBC data source, let's see the data source configuration of a Mondrian OLAP engine. In this video course, we're going to assume you already know the basis of the multidimensional model, and we won't look at the definition of a Mondrian schema on a relational database. If you're not sure about these issues, don't worry, because we're going to work on the samples provided with the downloadable Pentaho suite. Let's create a new data source directly inside a new report, in particular a Pentaho analysis data source. As you can see, there is also an OLAP 4J data source used as an emerging API to connect several OLAP engines like SAP BW, Palo, and Microsoft's analysis server. Denormalized and legacy versions of the two data sources are used in specific cases, but are not so common in practical cases. Once we're in the data source administration panel, we can point to define a Pentaho analysis schema file of Mondrian type, define a connection to the data in a relational database schema, and create one or more specific queries for the OLAP model. A Pentaho analysis schema file is simply an XML file defined with the Mondrian schema workbench of the Pentaho suite. In our case, the data used from the Mondrian schema is based on the default sample data source. But if we'd like to define our own, we can do that by simply using the green plus icon. Now it's time to define one or more queries using the Mondrian model. To add a new query, we can simply use the green plus icon in the panel and specify a name in the bottom right panel. It's important to know that the syntax of OLAP queries is similar to SQL queries, but based on a different standard called MDX. In this example, we're going to retrieve the sales value grouped by months and indicating also quarters and years. Let's see the preview. Now that the data source is ready, we can go ahead in the way we know using the fields in our report. Let's add the year, the quarter, the month, and finally the sales as number. In this video, we learn how to define a connection to a Mondrian OLAP engine. In the next tutorial, we'll configure the data source to an XML source or a table. Now that we know how to configure a data source on an OLAP engine, let's see the data source configuration on an XML source or a table. XML data sources are very useful while exporting the data from an external system when we can't use a database of structured data that is different from the file system. Let's create a new data source directly inside a report, in particular an XML data source. Once we're in the data source administration panel, we can point to an existing XML file and create one or more specific queries. The XML file can have the structure you prefer. In our case, a simple breakfast menu defined by a list of foods showing name, price, description, and calories. But the most important thing is that the query returns a list of fields for us to view. Exactly in the same way we saw for the JDBC connection, now it's time to define one or more queries on the XML. It's important to know that the syntax of the XML queries is in XPath format, the query language for this data type. Now that the data source is ready, we can go ahead in the way we know, using the fields in our report. Let's add the name, the price, the description, and finally the calories. And don't forget to pay attention to the length of the fields in the row. Let's create now a new report with a data source on a native table. Table data sources are very useful when the data is static and predefined. For example, when some data is not stored in any mass storage or configuration file. Compared with the other data sources, the table data source defines its structure directly inside the Pentaho Reporting Designer. For that reason, the first thing to do is to declare before the query and after define its structure, starting with a 2-column table. The definition of the table structure is straightforward. You can specify the value for the column, change the column name, add a new row, and add a new column. Also, we can remove rows and columns using the 2 buttons. Now that the data source is ready, we can go ahead in the way we know using the fields in our report. In this video, we learn how to define a connection to an XML source and table. In the next tutorial, we'll configure the data source to metadata and Pentaho Data Integration. Now that we know how to configure a data source on an XML and a table, let's see the data source configuration on metadata and Pentaho Data Integration. Pentaho Metadata allows a database administrator to define a way to query the relational data by user. It simplifies using the data and shields the database administrator from the complexities of the database schema. Let's now create a new data source directly inside a new report, in particular a metadata data source. Once we are in the data source administration panel, we can point to an existing XML file defining information about how to connect to the relational data source, the model mapping, and so on, give your own domain ID name, and create one or more specific queries on it. We create a query on Pentaho metadata using metadata query language called MQL, which is an XML-based format. Defining an MQL query is straightforward using the wizard. In our case, we select the customer name, the order date, and total. Let's see the preview. Now that the data source is ready, we can go ahead in the way we know using the fields in our report. In particular, let's add the customer name, the order date, and the total we defined before. Let's now create a new report with a data source on a Pentaho Data Integration. Pentaho Data Integration, also called Kettle, is a data integration tool that supports a multitude of data source inputs and outputs, and a huge variety of transformations. Once we are in the data source administration panel, we can add a new query very similar to the other data sources, and specify a KTR file defined in the Pentaho Data Integration environment. In the Steps panel, we can see a list of the transformation steps. We can preview the result by selecting a step and pressing the Preview button. Now that the data source is ready, we can go ahead in the way we know using the fields in our report. Let's add the region, the department, and finally the hello message. In this video, we learned how to define a connection to metadata and Pentaho Data Integration. In the next tutorial, we'll see how to work with data sources in Java. In Section 2, we developed and ran a report using the Pentaho Reporting Java API. Starting from that sample application in Swing, we're going to replace the dummy data with a real data source. Before starting to add the data source, let's see what the application looks like. Let's check the preview. As you can see, we will have a table showing a list of products with their respective values. In the Swing application, presented data is defined manually in the source code, but in real life, we want to add a data source, for example, from a relational database with an SQL query. To do that, we add a JDBC data source in the way we're going to show. In this case, we set the connection provider to the sample data HSQL database, and we query the list of the products with their quantity in stock. In our case, the field names match correctly with the query result, so we can run the report. Let's see the result. In the resulting table, pay attention to the length of the field to show all the information in the right way. As another example, we could change the data source to an XML file. To do this, we have to modify the source code in the connection provider part. The first thing we can see is that the XPath data factory is missing. To solve this, we have to add the extension library for XPath. We have to remember to copy the jar file in the lib folder and also to add it to the libraries of the project. Finally, let's import the package in the source code to correctly compile the Java. The queried XML source is what we used before. In our case, we want to show the name and the price of the breakfast menu. To show the name, we have to change the field name of the first text element. For the price, let's focus on the fact that with the XML source, all the fields are retrieved as text, so we have to change the second element. In this video, we learn how to work with data sources using a Java development environment. In the next section, we'll introduce all the graphic chart types and we'll see how to work with them. In the previous sections, we learnt the basic features of Pentaho Reporting with a first approach to Java development and data source connection. In this section, we're going to see how to include all the charts, graphics and images in Pentaho Reports using the Pentaho Report Designer. Our first task is to prepare an initial report. We're going to identify a data source, define a query with the most detailed data possible, and finally define a layout with charts and graphical elements. In our case, we're going to see the example starting from a product list with code and description, by price and retail price. Starting from this basic report, we drag the chart element from the vertical bar on the left and we drop it into the group header where the details will be aggregates according to the settings. Let's double-click the chart area to access the properties list. First of all, we have to choose the right chart, in our case a line chart. Let's define the category column as the product line, then the value columns with by price, and the series by value with the descriptions. Give the chart a title, remove the border from the legend, show the report. Here we have. Now let's add a more MSRP equals manufacturer's suggested retail price. Add a more MSPC equals manufacturer's suggested retail price. Add series label. Add show markers. Show the report. And again, here we have two examples of line charts. Change to horizontal. (3D). Now we'll be able to add a line chart to our reports very easily. Next, we'll go deep into the different available charts to show what can be done. In the previous video, we saw how to incorporate a line chart into a Pentaho report. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to incorporate other supported chart types and their common properties. Starting from the previous example with no chart in the report, let's start by adding a bar chart. In the previous tutorial, we talked about line charts, and here we can see common properties. The data source section, where we can specify fields and information about the data to show in the report. Let's select the product line as the category column and the buy price as the value column together with the correct title. The chart rendering, where, for example, we can define a title and some common information. Let's see the resulting report. To change the chart type, we simply have to change it directly in the settings area. In the example, we changed to an area chart. Another interesting common property to all chart types is the message shown when no data is retrieved. To simulate the absence of the data, let's remove the value columns and change the custom message we would like to show. Let's now see another chart type, the pie chart. In the value column, we set the buy price, and in the series by field column, let's choose the product line. Let's first see the preview in the form of a pie chart, and now the same report in the form of a ring chart. Another interesting chart type is the multi-pie chart. Let's select the multi-pie chart from the top bar and set the product vendor in the category column. Then set the buy price in the value column. For this example, it could be interesting to remove or manage the legend. This is possible using a common property to all the chart types, the legend settings. To complete the list of different chart types, let's see an example of waterfall charts. In this case, let's select a waterfall chart and select the product line as category column and remove the product line from the series by field column. Let's see the preview. And also radar charts. And a more complex bar line chart. Now let's see a more complex bar line chart, where we set the product line as category column and set the MSRP, that means manufacturer's suggested retail price, as value column. OK. An interesting feature is the values management that lets you, for example, show value labels and X and Y settings. In this tutorial, we saw how to incorporate all the different supported charts and their most relevant common properties. In the next video, we're going to customize charts in the report with very specific settings for each different chart type. In the last tutorial, we saw how to incorporate all the different supported charts and their most relevant common properties. In this video, we're going to customize the most relevant chart types using some detailed settings. Starting from the previous example, let's start by adding a bar chart. After the chart is correctly inserted into the page, we set the product line as category column and the buy price together with the manufacturer's suggested retail price as value columns. Let's remove the legend from the presentation by selecting false as its value and customizing it with stacked columns with borders and values, values as labels, and 3D. As you can see, with these specific settings, some labels could be missed simply because there is no space for rendering them with those values. This is not a serious problem, and you can solve it easily enlarging the area for the chart or changing the labels in terms of font and position. Going ahead, we can do the same customizations for the area chart. With a pie chart, it might be interesting to control the orientation of the slices. First of all, let's add the buy price as value column and product line as series, showing a right to left presentation. And we can change the rotate clockwise setting to false to have the opposite effect. Let's see the preview. Or with a ring chart, we can change the section depth from fat to thin. Regarding the pie chart and the ring chart, you could want to explode the slices using the explode options in the settings, but you have to remember that this is not possible in the case of 3D charts. And last but not least, let's do some customizations for a bar line chart, where we set the product line in the category and the buy price in the value of the primary data source, and the product line in the category and the manufacturer's suggested retail price in the value of the secondary data source. We can control the line options and the secondary y-axis for the secondary data source. Now that we've seen how to customize charts into a report, let's see how to incorporate images in different formats. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to incorporate all the different supported charts in a report. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to render dynamic images for different uses. To work with the different types of images, we start with a report developed on a data source with a product name, a product code, and some other fields we will use during the tutorial. The first type of image we would like to use is the barcode image. In this example, we're going to render a barcode in code 128 symbol format, using the product code field retrieved in the data source. There are several symbol formats we can use. For example, code 39 or PDF 417. Now that we know how to insert a barcode into our report, let's see how to set up and use sparklines. Remember that a sparkline is a very small line chart, typically drawn without axis or coordinates. So we're going to use the sparkline field of the data source that retrieves a list of values in comma-separated values format. First, let's see the line sparkline in action. But before we go ahead, let's adjust the dimensions of the chart in the row, and then the bar sparkline. Also in this case, we're going to use the sparkline field to have a chart very similar to the line sparkline, but with bars. A quite different type of sparkline is the pie sparkline that requires a value from 0 to 1 to be shown. Let's see it in action. Last but not least, let's see how to use the survey scale as the way of graphically representing values on a predefined scale. In this case, pay attention to the length of the field to show it correctly in the report. Now that we have seen how to customize images and charts in a report, in the next section we're going to modify them using parameters and internationalization. In the last section, we learned how to use graphic charts and images in Pentaho Reports using the Pentaho Report Designer. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to make the Pentaho report parameterized by specifying parameters in the user interface. Starting from a previous example of a Pentaho report, we're going to add some specific parameterization. Report parameterization allows end users to customize results by entering values that limit report datasets or trigger rendering decisions. In our case, we'd like to limit the results to a single product vendor and filter the report by vehicle list. To do this, we add a report parameter using the button on the Data tab of the Report Explorer. Defining a parameter is quite straightforward. Let's define a name, a label, a value type, and other specific characteristics. And finally, how the parameter will prompt us for the values. There are several ways to prompt for parameters. We're going to use the drop-down list. The requested query will populate the drop-down prompt when the report is rendered. In our case, we have to define a new query directly in the data source. Let's type the following in the name and query panels and see the preview. We're now ready to render the report with the new parameter. As you can see, the report is not shown until the parameter is selected. From now on, any limit is defined in the query and depends on the product vendor parameter. To do this, we use a very simple syntax directly in the data source, in the way we're going to show. As you can see, the syntax is based on the $ plus the use of the curly brackets. That's all. Let's now see the most relevant parameter types in action, the single value list. Let's open a few vendors and go to our Edit Parameter tab. The single selection button. And finally, the multi-values parameter. To use the multi-values parameter, you simply modify the query. And that's all. Now you can use the multi-value list to specify the parameter. Now that we can parameterize our reports, let's see how to do the parameterization using a Java environment. In the last tutorial, we learned how to add parameters to a Pentaho report using the Pentaho Report Designer. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to manage Pentaho reports with parameters in a Swing application or a web application, in both cases using Java. First of all, let's work on a report saved in the file system called My First Report with Parameter. The report is the same one we used in the last tutorial and has one parameter named Product Vendor Parameter. Let's start by seeing how to manage Pentaho reports with parameters in a Swing application. To do this, we use the My First Swing App project we first used in section 2. The first thing to do is change the rendered report to the one with the parameter. To set the parameter to a specific value, the master report object has a getParametersValue method that retrieves all the report parameters in a report parameters object. Using the put method of the report parameters object, we can set a specific value. Let's see the result. In a swing application, the rendering windows let us change the parameter to a different value. In the same way, we can set a parameter value for a web application. To do this, we use the My First Web App project we initially worked on in section 2. Also in this case, the first thing to do is change the rendered report to the one with the parameter. Let's change the PRPT file. Exactly in the same way, using the same objects and methods, we set the product vendor parameter. Let's see the result. Launching the server. Opening the browser at the My First Web App URL and generating the report. That's all. Now that we can parameterize our reports, also in a Java application, in the next tutorial we'll see how to work with functions and expressions. In the last few tutorials, we learned how to manage parameters of a Pentaho report using the Pentaho Report Designer or a Java application. In this video, we're going to see how to work with functions and expressions in Pentaho Reporting. Before starting, let's recall what functions and expressions are. We use a function in Pentaho Reporting to calculate a value during the creation of a report. An example is the report date. An expression is simply a function whose scope is limited to the current dataset row. Pentaho Reporting defines a huge amount of functions. All the functions are grouped together in the menu. We select a function by double-clicking on it. In this example, we put the page number in the page footer. Let's see the preview. Here's our page number. Next, we're going to add the total page count. Let's place the total page count number, copy-paste the formatting, and align them. And finally, replace all with the easier page of pages. The page of pages shows the page number together with the total number in the whole report. To wrap up this brief summary of functions and expressions, let's see some interesting summary functions in action. Our goal is to view the sum of all the quantities. To recognize it from the other fields, we set a different format and color. Next, we could add the group count to view the number of vehicles retrieved, before adding the filed to the function list, and then putting it in the group footer. Now that we can use functions and expressions in Pentaho Reports, in the next tutorial we'll see how to work with formulas. In the last tutorial, we learned how to work with functions and expressions in Pentaho Reporting. In this video, we're going to see how to work with formulas. Before starting to work with them, let's recall what formulas are. Like functions and expressions, we use formulas to generate dynamic content and in particular to derive element property and style values. Formulas are based on the Open Formula standard, similar to Excel formula support, and used in OpenOffice as well as in other tools. Now let's see our first example of property customization. In this example, we would like to round the quantity to the lowest 100 value. But before that, let's identify the field in the structure. To do this, we define an expression for the field value by clicking on the green plus icon of the value attribute. In the panel that is displayed, we can enter a formula using the dictionary panel on the left. In our case, we use the int function directly on the quantity in stock field. Type the following query and press OK. Now let's see the result. This is how our report looks. In the next example, we're going to use formulas to make some style customizations. Here, we want to show in red quantities that are below a certain value, and in green quantities that are over this value. A kind of traffic light on the quantity. In this case, we create a new formula for the background color property. The formula uses the if command on the quantity in stock field to set the green colour if the quantity is greater than 5,000, or red colour if it is less or equal. Let's see the result. Now that we're able to use formulas in Pentaho Reports, in the next tutorial we'll discuss internalisation and localisation. In the last tutorial we learned how to work with formulas in Pentaho Reporting. In this video we're going to look at internalisation and localisation of a report with Pentaho Report Designer and with the Java development environment using Eclipse. Starting from the Pentaho report previously defined, let's have a look at the report element palette where we find the resource label, the resource field and the resource message. We use all of them to localize information in the way we're going to do for the title of the report. Let's now replace the title with a new resource label as we've done previously. Copy and paste the formatting and finally cut and paste the new title and rename the label. Now it's time to define the report.title property in the translation file. To do this, we edit the translations.properties file in the resources item. Now let's see. To localize the report to a given language, let's add a new translation file in the resources. The file name must be defined composing the word translations followed by the language encoding according to the I18N format. Let's now define the report title in the localized language. To change the default locale of the Pentaho Report Designer, let's modify the environment.designtime.locale configuration. Let's see the preview. From a Java perspective, we could achieve the same goal with only a few lines of code. In this example, we declare an it locale that we could change depending on our needs in the My First Swing app example previously defined. Starting from the report object, with this command we set the locale and everything is done. Let's see the result. Let's wait while the report is being generated. Now that we are able to control the localization of a Pentaho report, in the next section we'll discuss how to add and manage sub-reports. In the last section, we saw how to modify reports using parameters and internationalization. In this tutorial, we're going to see what a sub-report is and how to use it. We're going to start from a previous example that has a data source defined on a product line list without any detail in the report. Sub-reports allow you to embed reusable reports within a master report. To insert a sub-report into an existing master report, you simply have to drag and drop the sub-element into the right place. Note that sub-reports can be included in any band of your report, except for the page header and page footer. As you can see, there are two types of sub-reports. A banded sub-report that is attached to the root level band itself and is always printed below the band to where it is attached, and an inline sub-report that can be added to any band on any position and is printed at the given location. Processing inline sub-reports can consume a lot of memory and processing power. If your sub-report content spans the whole page width, it's better to use banded sub-reports to get the best performance. In this example, we want to define a sub-report that may span multiple pages, the so-called multi-page sub-report. To define it, right-click on the band in order to bring up the sub-report in a different and separate tab. As you can see, the sub-report editing is very similar to a master report, and the first thing to do is always to define the proper data source with a query. In our case, we are going to extract product code, the product name, quantity in stock, and buy price of a given product line. To make the sub-report relative to the master report, the query needs to contain a parameter which must be defined to make it available to the sub-report. Now it's time to define the imported parameter from the master report. Now it's time to define the layout in the way we already know. Product code, the product name, the quantity in stock, and the buy price. Let's also add the labels. For the code, the description, let's stretch the description window and copy-paste the formatting as usual. The price, and finally the quantity tab, but see that none of the tabs overlap. Now that we know how to add multi-page sub-reports in a Pentaho report, let's see how to add and customize a chart sub-report. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to add a multi-page sub-report in a Pentaho report. In this video, we're going to see how to customize and add charts to a sub-report. Starting from the same example we used in the last tutorial, our task here is to define a sub-report containing a bar chart which shows the best 3 vendors of each product line. Let's define a sub-report in the details band, this time as inline. To edit the sub-report, double-click on it. As usual, let's define the data source and return the best 3 vendors of each product line. The query uses the product table, grouping on the vendor and selecting the sum of the quantity in stock. Last but not least, let's add the filter to the product line with a parameter. Now it's time to define the imported parameter from the master report. As we have seen before, the parameter is called product line. To render the bar chart in the way we know, let's add the chart in the report header. Let's add the product vendor as category column and the quantity in stock as value column. Last but not least, let's hide the legend and give a name to the x-axis. Let's preview the result. Because of the use of an inline sub-report, we have to watch out for unexpected layout issues. In our case, for example, we don't have enough space to render the bar chart completely, and we'll have to choose to enlarge the sub-report band or reduce the chart. Here, we've decided to reduce the chart. To complete this example, let's correct the chart layout of the pie chart. In this tutorial, we saw how to customize and add charts to a sub-report. In the next tutorial, we're going to describe how to add a side-by-side sub-report in a Pentaho report. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to customize and add a chart to a sub-report. In this video, we're going to see how to add a side-by-side sub-report in a Pentaho report. Another capability of sub-reports is being able to place 2 or more within a report band. We want to demonstrate this functionality by taking the charting example defined in the last tutorial. In this example, we'd like to show a brief summary of the details of each product line. To do this, we add a new inline sub-report close to the one with the chart. As in the first sub-report, let's define the data source and layout with the name Sub-Report Detailed Query. To define the query, this time let's use the query wizard. The query uses the product table with the results grouped by vendor and aggregated in terms of quantity in stock and by price. Let's add an expression and select sum. Now, let's define the parameter for the product line. The parameter is going to have the name product line. Now it's time to define the imported parameter from the master report. Finally, let's compose the report in the way we know. Let's add the product vendor, the quantity in stock, and the buy price. Let's align and resize them as we move on. Let's also change the font and change the formatting while we're at it. Let's add the labels for the vendor, the quantity, and the price. Let's incorporate a violet shade for the labels. Now it's time to preview the result. In this video, we saw how to add a side-by-side sub-report. In the next tutorial, we're going to add cross-tabs in a Pentaho report. In the previous tutorial, we saw how to add a side-by-side sub-report. In this video, we're going to see how to add crosstabs in a Pentaho report. Crosstabs are used in reports to show dimensional data. They are defined by two or more fields of a table. They can be description fields or alternatively numeric fields that define the so-called measures. For instance, you may want to see total sales for each product vendor during the course of a month. Because crosstabs are still considered experimental in the Pentaho Report Designer, the first thing we have to do is activate them. To enable the crosstab capabilities and all the experimental features, we go to the Edit menu and Preferences. Now we're ready to create the report and its cross-table sub-report. As usual, let's define the data source that will return product vendor and total sales price per month. The results are ordered by product vendor and month respectively. Let's see the preview. Now that we've defined the data source, it's time to define the layout. To do this, we have to explicitly enable the feature adding the crosstab group directly in the report. Once enabled, new bands and structures are added to the report which modify the layout. Next, we have to properly evaluate the row group and column group and the details. Let's see how. Let's select a crosstab group and select product vendor. Let's add a string field and add the product vendor again. Tweak the formatting a bit, fonts and widths, and add a few attributes. Select month desk in the field attribute and repeat the same for the total price as well. Last but not least, some details of the layout have to be properly set to give us the final result. Now it's time to see the result. In this video, we saw how to add crosstabs in a Pentaho report. In the next section, we're going to build interactive swing and HTML reports. In the last section, we saw how to add sub-reports and crosstabs to your Pentaho reports. In this section, we're going to see how to build interactive reports starting from swing applications. An interactive report is basically driven by events. For this reason, event bindings are defined in the report's definition, making it possible to receive event notifications from within the report itself. In the Pentaho Reporting API, there are three different types of events defined: actions, hyperlinks, and mouse events. For each of the three types of events, the Pentaho Reporting API defines a related Java interface, which is used to retrieve event callbacks from within the report. Let's start from a static report and see each of the events in some practical examples. The first thing we want to do is insert a new rectangle object, which represents an interactive button for an action. Let's set the action parameters in the attribute panel. The button label is going to be named as Action and identified with the Action1 ID in the Swing environment. There you go. Let's save and preview it. Now that the report is defined, it's time to give the Swing project the correct event callbacks. This simple project contains a method called createReport, which is used to aggregate everything needed to create a new report from a PRPT file. The main method with an engine start, the creation of the dashboard, the closing window listener that disposes the dashboard, the initial setup of the dashboard. Let's see it in action. Now it's time to add an action listener that will retrieve the event callbacks from within the report. In our case, we'd like to render a simple dialog window that contains the action parameter we initially defined in the report definition. To do that, we invoke the Add Report Action Listener on a new object. The new object is going to show a message dialog directly in the pane with the action parameter as content. Let's change this arg0 to event and replace the following syntax to show message dialog method. We can easily retrieve the action parameter using the getActionParameter method directly in the event. Let's see it in action. Moving on with the different event types, let's see how to set and manage a hyperlink. Directly in the report definition, let's add a new image and set the URL property in the Style panel. As our first task, let's add a new PNG file to the image object. Let's import this link.png and add its URL link to www.google.com. Now it's time to add a hyperlink listener to retrieve the event callbacks from within the report. In our case, we'd like to render a simple dialog window containing the hyperlink. Before we add the listener, we have to import the correct classes and libraries. After, we invoke the add report hyperlink listener on a new object. The new object is going to show a message dialog directly in the pane with the URL parameter as content. Let's replace this listener by new report hyperlink listener and the arg0 by event as in the previous case. And then type in the following syntax. Let's see it in action. Last but not least, let's see how to set and manage a mouse event. Back to the report definition, let's add a new button and set the name property in the attribute panel. To do this, let's name it button 1 and add a label with value as button. Let's place it properly so it looks good and then preview it. Exactly in the same way we saw for the other events, let's add a mouse event listener to retrieve the event callbacks from within the report. In our case, we'd like to render a simple dialog window containing a description of the action. As you can see, we could use several events to manage the drag action, the move action, and finally the press action. With the mouse events, it's important to filter the actions using the name property, otherwise the listener will intercept lots of unexpected events. We can easily retrieve the name parameter using the getName method directly in the event. In our case, we're going to show a message dialog directly in the pane with the press button name as content. For doing so, let's type in the following syntax, this command, to show a dialog window with the message pressed and the name of the button, in our case, button 1. Now let's see it in action. In this example, we saw the fundamentals of interactive reports, but in reality, almost anything can be done with this feature. Finally, we'd like to see how to retrieve another report using the action we defined previously. To do this, let's work on the action listener and add some Java code to create a new report. The report we are going to create is named My First Report, and in the same way we've seen before, is developed in a PRPT file. Let's make the following changes in the current code and add the following queries. Let's see it in action. Now that we know how to build interactive reports using a Swing application, let's see how to do the same thing in a web application using HTML. In the last section, we saw how to build interactive reports using a Swing application. In this section, we're going to see how to do the same thing in a web application using HTML. Starting from the previous example, let's see how to make the report interactive from the link of each element. In our case, we'd like to open a URL from a button directly inside the report. The button label is going to be named as button. Let's center align it, change and increase the font size and place it inside the button. Now let's set a hyperlink as well. In this case, using the HTML preview, we can test the interaction directly in the Pentaho Report Designer using a web browser. Another example of an interactive report is using the JavaScript language. In our case, we would like to invoke a JavaScript function when we click on a product line detail. Let's see the preview. It might be more interesting if the interaction showed hidden information, like, for example, the price. To do this, we're going to use a formula with the buy price field of the data source. The formula is going to define the JavaScript command with the content of the buy price field. We'll place this formula in the onClick event and type the following attributes. Let's see the resulting preview. Report interaction could also manipulate the HTML DOM. In our case, we'd like to change the document title after pressing the button. To do this, we add a label with the change title in its description. Let's improve its look to make it look pleasant and noticeable. Now let's add a JavaScript command in the onClick event of the HTML attributes. Type the following command. Let's see the preview. Last but not least, let's see a more interesting example using Java. We want to click on the product line description and open a report that lists all the detail specific for that product line. In other words, we'd like to make two reports interact, the first as master and the second as details. To do this, we're going to execute the report in a Java environment using Eclipse, where we have developed a basic web project composed of a static page called index.html used to invoke the interactive report in HTML format, my first interactive web app class, which is very similar to the one described in section 2, except for the response content type, which this time is in HTML format. Let's see it in action. Now it's time to modify the interactive report to activate the link to the detailed report. To do this, we use the URL property in the Style panel of the product line field. Exactly in the same way we saw before, we use a formula to dynamically define the target URL. The URL is composed of the page subreport with the product line given as a dynamic parameter. Before seeing the report in action, let's see the target report, the one with the details. This is a very simple report, very similar to the ones we developed before. The report uses a mandatory parameter representing the product line, which is used in the data source as a filter. Let's see it in action. Now it's time to modify the Java code to make the report interactive. As we've seen before, the target link invokes a subreport URL. For everything to work properly, we have to define the subreport URL in the Java project using the mySubreport class. The mySubreport class is very similar to the myFirstInteractive web app class, except for the product line parameter, which is set with the requested parameter value. Let's see it in action. To view the result, let's click on a single description of the product line and click on Classic Cars. In this section, we saw how to build interactive reports using Swing and web applications. In the next section, we'll see how to use Pentaho Report in the Pentaho suite especially in the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server and the Pentaho Data Integration, nicknamed Kettle. In the last section, we saw how to build interactive reports using Swing and web applications. In this tutorial, we're going to see how to use Pentaho Reports in the Pentaho suite, especially in the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server. The Business Intelligence Server is a web application which allows users to publish and manage reports and has many capabilities, including the execution of Pentaho Reports. By combining Pentaho Reporting and Pentaho BI Server, consultants can use Pentaho Reporting in their preferred environment without writing any code. Our first task is to check the prerequisites of the system and install the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server. Pentaho Business Intelligence Server is written in pure Java. This allows the application to be run by any operating system with a Java virtual machine. In our case, we're using Java 7. Next, we need to download the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server from the Pentaho website. We've downloaded the archive package and it's ready to be unzipped in the download folder. To install the binary distribution is quite simple. Just create a directory in your machine and unzip the contents of the package into this directory. Before starting the server, let's edit the config file to define the publisher password. The config file is present in the system folder. Let's modify the publisher config.xml file in the tag publisher password by making the following changes. That's all. Now that you have successfully installed the Business Intelligence Server, you can run it by launching the script in the installation directory. Notice that in this folder you will also find scripts with different extensions for other operating systems. After a few seconds, you'll be able to open the Pentaho User Console in your browser. The Pentaho User Console is where the BI-related content is hosted and lets you create, execute and manage new or existing content. To complete the startup of the BI server, you have to run the administration console by executing the script in the installation directory. The script starts an application which is hosted by a Jetty web server. After a few seconds, you can go to the Pentaho administration console in your browser. The default username is admin and the default password is password. The Pentaho administration console is used to aggregate and simplify many common administrative tasks, such as managing users and roles, scheduling jobs, and managing services. Now that you have successfully started the Business Intelligence Server, let's see how to publish a report and how to use it in the BI server. Starting from a previous example, let's check that everything is properly defined to publish the report in the BI server. One of the most common mistakes occurs with the definition of the data source. We can see the report is working properly, but we must check that the defined data source also exists in the server environment. To do this, let's use the administration console. As we can see, the data source name is different, so we have to decide whether to add a new one in the server environment or, alternatively, adjust the report to point to the existing one. Here, we chose to change the report, but in this way we have discovered how to add and manage the BI data sources. To do this, we changed the data source connection from the local one to the generic one. Let's see the preview. Okay, now that everything is defined, let's publish the report in the way we saw in the first section. When you publish a report, remember you cannot publish anything in the root of the repository, but you have to define or use a folder. The final task in publishing a report is remembering to note down the publisher's password. Answer yes to this question and you'll see the report directly in the Pentaho BI server, but in our case, we prefer to dive into the repository using the Pentaho User Console. Well done. Once the report is published in the repository, we can use the Pentaho User Console to browse the repository. Before doing this, let's log into the BI server. A welcome screen appears. Click on this green arrow to view our report. Our report will be present in the My Company directory. Here's our report in the HTML format, Let's view it in the PDF format. We can view it in all these available formats. Setting the output type, we can get all the supported formats dynamically, like, for example, in PDF format or Excel format. From the Pentaho User Console, we can also manage rights and permissions. This is a very important feature for managing practical cases because from this panel we can manage all the permissions in detail for each user or role. We can manage them directly in the Administration Console form on the Users and Roles tab. Last but not least, let's introduce the scheduler, which we can use to execute reports or actions periodically. To schedule the execution of a report is very straightforward, but actually not so useful in practice. Possibly more useful in practice is the ability to email a report to a user or a group. To do this, we have to define an action in the Pentaho Design Studio. This isn't covered in this video course. To check the state of scheduled jobs, we can use the Pentaho User Console to view the workspace dashboard. Now that we know how to use Pentaho Reports in the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server, let's see the Pentaho Data Integration in action, nicknamed Kettle. In the last section, we saw how to use Pentaho Reports in the Pentaho Business Intelligence Server. In this video, we're going to see how to use Pentaho Reports in the Pentaho Data Integration, the so-called Kettle. The Pentaho Data Integration, also known as Kettle, delivers powerful extraction, transformation, and loading capabilities using an innovative metadata-driven approach with an intuitive graphical drag-and-drop design environment. By combining Pentaho Reporting and Pentaho Data Integration, consultants can use Pentaho Reporting in their environment without writing any code. As for all the Pentaho suite, our first task is to check the prerequisites of the system. The Pentaho Data Integration is also written in pure Java, which allows the application to be run by any operating system with a Java virtual machine. In our case, we're using Java 7. Next, we need to download the Pentaho Data Integration from the Pentaho website. We downloaded the archived package and now it's ready to be unzipped in the download folder. To install the binary distribution is very straightforward. Just create a directory in your machine and unzip the contents of the package into this directory. That's all. Now you have successfully installed Pentaho Data Integration, you can run it by launching the Spoon script in the installation directory. Spoon is a graphical user interface that allows you to design transformations and jobs that can be run with other Kettle tools that we're going to use a little later. After a few seconds, you'll see the Spoon welcome screen and a form requesting repository information. As we saw for the Pentaho Report Designer, Kettle can also use a so-called repository or the file system to store information. In our case, we choose the file system. We don't have enough time to dive deep into Spoon, but the most relevant thing to know is that Kettle is based on two main concepts. Transformations that define a flow of activities on a data stream, typically modifying information from a source to a destination, and jobs that define a flow of job entries, like, for example, transformations. In our case, we have to define a transformation first, and then a very simple job that invokes it. Let's rename our transformation as My First Transformation and save it. Before starting to develop the transformation, exactly in the same way we did for the Business Intelligence Server, we have to set the data sources used in the Pentaho report. Let's see the Pentaho report and the data source used, in our case, the sample data local. Now let's define the same data source in the transformation environment. To do this, we are going to add a generic database connection with that custom connection URL. The driver class specific for the database, in our case an HSQLDB. And the login with the password. Also, let's give the connection a name. Well done. Once the data source is defined, we're ready to develop the transformation. In our case, the transformation starts with a data grid object which generates the data stream. The data stream is composed of two fields, the PRPT path containing the complete path of the Pentaho report and the target path containing the destination path of the report in the final format. Now it's time to define the stream content. Let's add the PRPT path in its column and the target path in its column. Once the data stream is created, we use the Pentaho Reporting output object to automatically process the report. In the administration panel, we can use the PRPT path to define the source from the stream and the target path to define the destination file. If some parameters are present in the PRPT file, we could set them using the panel, but in our case this isn't necessary. Instead, a mandatory setting is the definition of the output format. In our case, we choose PDF. Now we're ready to save the transformation and run it for the very first time. There we go. The transformation has finished. Let's view the result. Okay. Probably it's clear that with this solution, the output format could easily be changed simply by changing the data stream and later the Pentaho Reporting output object. Let's see the result. Opening the HTML file on the desktop. Now that we have seen how to define a transformation, let's see how to develop a job containing the transformation itself and how to run it from the command line. The development of the job is very straightforward. In the same way we have done for the transformation, we are going to name the job and save it on the file system. We add now a start task, a transformation pointing to the one we have developed before, and success as ending task. Let's add a success block and interconnect the transformation block to the one we just added. Directly from Spoon, exactly in the way we saw for the transformation, we execute the job by pressing the green arrow. OK, in our case, the development of the job is useful to its execution from the command line. Using the kitchen model, we can run jobs without the Spoon user interface, typically in a production environment when we want to schedule tasks and processes using crontab. Let's see how. Here we are going to invoke the kitchen command on the file containing the job we have developed before. Let's wait until the loading takes place. There you go, the processing has finished. In this video course, we dive deep into Pentaho Reporting, one of the milestones in the leading open source business intelligence platform known as Pentaho. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks also to everyone who worked on the project. Goodbye.